All right, so ever find yourself really kind of digging into the nuts and bolts of philosophical arguments? Like those fundamental assumptions, those building blocks that everything rests on?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like a constant process, right? You're always questioning, examining, trying to figure out why some ideas just click, why they feel inherently, well, true.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this idea of intuition. Now, it's a word we all use, but in philosophy, it's got a specific meaning, not just a gut feeling, like you said.
Exactly. In philosophy, intuition is more about that moment when a proposition just seems true in a specific way. Like, can a square have 5 sides? That doesn't just seem false, it feels impossible. It's that seeming we're after.
Right, like a sense of immediate truth hits you. And for this deep dive, we're not messing around with flimsy sources. We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on intuition. That's like the gold standard, right?
The SEP, yeah, they offer a really comprehensive view of intuition, all the nuances, the debates. And that's what we're aiming for today, to give you, fellow philosophers, anyone interested in this, a clearer picture of what philosophical intuitions are, how crucial they are in our field, and the challenges we face when we use them.
Perfect. So let's unpack this idea of seeming true.
Hmm.
What are we talking about here? Beyond the everyday sense of intuition, what's the core of philosophical intuition?
It's about that immediate sense of a proposition seeming true, like we said. The SEPIG gives some examples, familiar ones. If not P, then P. Or a 5-sided square is impossible. Torturing someone for fun is inherently wrong. Even those thought experiments, like brain transplants, these all evoke this strong sense of self-evident truth.
Right, not the hunch you get before a game or recognizing a pattern you've seen before. It's more about this armchair philosophical insight, right?
Yeah, exactly. The SEP distinguishes this from expert judgment based on experience or everyday hunches. It's about this specific seeming from philosophical reflection. And this seemingly simple idea, it's led to a lot of debate on what these intuitions actually are.
For sure, because it's easy to say something seems true, but what is that feeling? How do we define it?
One view is that intuitions are just beliefs. Lewis argued this, that our intuitions are opinions. Some basic, some complex, but ultimately beliefs. He was going for parsimony. Why create a new mental state when we have beliefs?
Keeps things simple. If intuitions are beliefs, it streamlines things, right?
It's elegant. And it fits that we often do believe what we intuit, but there are strong counter-arguments. For example, logical paradoxes. You might intuitively grasp each step in a contradictory argument, even knowing the conclusion is false. So, intuition without the belief.
Like those self-referential statements that twist your brain. You see both sides logically, but they can't both be true.
Yeah, exactly. The SEP also reminds us that we can believe things without intuiting them. You might believe a complex math proof because an expert vouched for it, but you don't necessarily intuit its truth, or the Miller-Lyer illusion. You know the lines are equal, but they still look unequal. Like, maybe some moral intuitions are ineliminable moral illusions, as Kagan put it. The feeling stays even if reasoning says otherwise.
That's a good point, that disconnect between belief and intuition. So if they're not beliefs, what else could they be?
Another idea is that intuitions are dispositions to believe. Van Inwagen proposed this, that they're tendencies to accept things without being a full-fledged belief yet.
Like an inclination, a predisposition.
Exactly. This allows for having an intuition without believing it right now. But the SEP argues this might be too broad. We can be disposed to believe things for many reasons. Not all of them are philosophical intuition.
So just being inclined to believe something doesn't have that immediate seems true quality.
Right. So refined it. Intuition that P is a disposition to believe P merely because you understand P. It ties the disposition to understanding.
More targeted. It connects the inclination directly to grasping the idea.
But one critique remains. Many feel intuitions have a conscious, occurrent nature. When you have one, you actively experience it. Dispositions might not capture that. You could be disposed to believe something but not actively feel it right now. Like a complex logical axiom, you might believe it when you consider it, but not feel it all the time.
I get that. It's different from something I'd agree with if I thought about it versus something that hits me as true right now.
Okay.
So what's the alternative? Is intuition its own thing altogether?
That leads to the idea that intuitions are sui generis states. Unique, occurrent, distinct from belief or disposition. Philosophers like Beeler, Pust, Humer, Chudnoff, Bengtson, Coxvick, they all have variations, but they agree that believing P isn't necessary or sufficient for intuiting P, and they reject dispositions. They argue that when you intuit, P doesn't just seem possible, it seems true, is presented as true, even pushes you towards belief, like taste. Sweetness isn't just a disposition to say sweet, it's a distinct experience. Intuition is a distinct intellectual flavor.
So it's the way our minds engage with an idea, a way of knowing.
Yes, exactly. Beeler, for example, he describes this seeming as a conscious episode, not just hesitant acceptance, like De Morgan's law. At first, it's not obvious, but after thinking, it just seems true, clear as day.
That aha moment where it all clicks.
Exactly. And within this sui generis view, there are distinctions. Some talk about intellectual seeming broadly, while others, like Beeler, focus on rational intuition, intellectual seeming of necessity. Philosophical intuitions often feel not just true, but necessarily true. It couldn't be otherwise. Unlike, say, an intuition about a fact in the world.
Like the five-sided square. It's not just false here, it's impossible everywhere.
Exactly. But the Sempi points out issues with this necessity focus. A new philosophy student can have rational intuitions, but maybe not grasp metaphysical necessity yet. Also, we have intuitions about possibilities, things that could be. Requiring necessity might make those tricky. Like, it's possible that P becomes, it necessarily seems possible that P bit cumbersome.
So even within this unique state idea, there's debate. And I imagine some philosophers are skeptical of this whole sui generis thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Williamson, for example, he's skeptical. He says he doesn't experience any intellectuals seeming beyond being inclined to believe. He challenges proponents to explain these states. What's this seeming beyond belief or disposition? What are skeptics missing?
Like describing a color to someone who sees everything in grayscale.
Good analogy. Williamson also says we call many things counterintuitive, not just negations of intuitions. Like a theory saying mountains don't exist is counterintuitive, but mountains exist isn't usually a philosophical intuition in this strict sense.
That's a good point. How would someone defend sui generis intuitions against that?
One response is to reframe the counterintuitive claim. Maybe it's not no mountains, literally, but that mountains are metaphysically impossible. The negation of that could be an intuition. Another defense is to say counterintuitive just means we have strong reasons to believe the opposite.
So the debate on what intuitions are is far from settled. But let's move to their role in philosophy. How do we use them?
The SIPP emphasizes that we use intuitions as evidence, reasons for accepting claims. One key example is the method of cases. We see this constantly in philosophy, right? You create these hypothetical scenarios and examine our gut reactions.
Ah, yes, the classic philosophical tool. The Gettier case, trolley problem, brain in a vat. All about eliciting intuitions.
Exactly. The SEP gives examples, you'll recognize them. The Gettier case, our intuition, is that Smith doesn't know, even with a justified true belief. This challenges the JTB theory of knowledge.
It's a counterexample. The theory seems to apply, but our intuition says no.
Exactly. The transplant case, the surgeon sacrificing one to save many. Our intuition says it's wrong, challenging utilitarianism. The Chinese nation, the intuition is no qualia, challenging functionalism. The flagpole case, deduction isn't enough for explanation, against some logic accounts.
These scenarios are like probes, testing our intuitive judgments. And when a theory clashes with intuition, that's a problem for the theory.
Right. Agreement with intuitions is prima facie support. Conflict undermines it. The SCP even suggests that this reliance on intuition might be what sets philosophy apart from science. Scientists experiment, we analyze thought experiments.
A key difference in methodology. There's not just specific weird cases, right? We also use more general intuitions.
Absolutely. Think about epistemological rationalism. The idea that some beliefs are justified not through experience, but through rational intuition. Direct grasping of truth. The set gives examples like, nothing can be red and green all over, or 2 + 2 = 4, or basic logical principles. These seem true just by thinking. No need for experiments.
Like, I don't need to find a round square to know it's impossible. The idea itself feels wrong.
Exactly. And while case-based intuitions are specific, these are general. But the SEP notes that lots of philosophical claims, from justification to metaphysics to morals, are often said to be intuitive.
So intuitions are everywhere in philosophy, both in specific cases and in general principles. But when we talk about them as evidence, what's the evidence? Is it having the intuition or what the intuition is about?
That's a key distinction the SB makes. Intuitings versus intuitids. Is it the psychological act or the content?
If it's just the psychological state, that seems like we're psychologizing philosophy, basing it on subjective experience, not objective truth.
Yeah, that's a concern. Buddhist, Williamson, they've raised this. If it's just a mental state, how does that justify claims about the world, about metaphysics, ethics? Plus, most arguments don't say I have an intuition. They just state claims about knowledge, justice, etc.
Right? You rarely see the author felt strongly in a paper.
But ignoring that something feels intuitively true seems to ignore something important about how we grasp it. Even if the final evidence is objective, that feeling plays a role.
So maybe the best view, like the Accept suggests, is that the intuiting gives initial justification for the intuited. Both matter. The feeling is the initial reason. Then we argue from there.
Yes, exactly. And some views, especially those focused on knowledge, might even say that intuitive beliefs are knowledge, so they are evidence. But this whole idea that intuitions are evidence, well, it's faced some challenges lately.
Really? Who's challenging that?
Philosophers like Williamson, Kaplan, Deutsch, they argue that when you look at how we actually do philosophy, we're not appealing to intuition as the evidence. It's the arguments that matter. They might say that even in thought experiments, it's the logic, not the gut feeling, that persuades us.
Like saying it feels right is shorthand for a bunch of assumptions and reasoning we're not making explicit.
That's their view. But those defending intuition have counter-arguments. They say we need introspection, philosophical analysis. Just because there's an argument doesn't mean the premises aren't intuitive. And they point to how we actually talk, saying even in case-based reasoning, intuitions about the case details are often what we're trying to explain.
So the debate on whether and how intuitions are evidence is still going strong. Now, the SIP also talks about skepticism towards intuition. What are some of the main arguments against relying on them?
Skeptics question whether we're justified in believing our intuitions. The SIP outlines 4 criteria for a good skeptical argument: a normative premise, a non-normative premise, a local skepticism constraint, and a non-self-undermining constraint.
Important criteria. You can't just say intuitions are bad if your own argument relies on intuition. So what are some of the arguments?
One is the argument from lack of independent calibration. The idea is that you're only justified if you have independent justification for reliability. And we lack that for intuitions because there's often no overlap between what they tell us and what we can verify independently.
Like, you can't run an experiment to prove torture for fun is wrong.
Right. But this argument has issues. This calibration demand could lead to an infinite regress, and any argument for it would likely use epistemic intuitions, becoming self-undermining.
It's hard to judge one tool if you have to use that same tool to judge it. So what about arguments saying intuitions are unreliable?
There's the argument from unreliability. The basic version says we need reliability for justification, and intuitions aren't reliable. But the new evil demon thought experiment challenges this. Someone being deceived has justified beliefs, even if they're all false.
Their reasoning is sound, even if the information's bad.
So there's a second version, the argument from unreliability's second version. We're justified only if we don't have reasons to think the source is unreliable. And skeptics say we do have reasons to doubt intuitions because of inconsistencies. Within one person, intrapersonal, and between people, interpersonal.
Like, those logical paradoxes are intrapersonal inconsistencies.
Right. But most of our intuitions aren't contradictory. The bigger issue is disagreement between people. Philosophers disagreeing on intuitions suggests unreliability.
But the SIP mentions that there might be more agreement on basic intuitions than on the theories built from them.
Exactly. Beeler argues there's a lot of agreement on basic, concrete intuitions. Disagreements are often explained away, not just dismissed. Also, much of the work on disagreement focuses on beliefs based on shared evidence. If intuitions aren't like that, disagreement might work differently. And it's hard to know what someone's lack of intuition means. Maybe they don't understand, have different assumptions, or think differently.
So disagreement is complicated. What's the next challenge?
The arguments from explanation. 2 forms. Either the best explanation for our intuitions doesn't involve them being true, lack of explanatory necessity, or we can't explain how they could be reliable. Inexplicability of reliability.
The first one sounds like the worry that intuitions are just products of biology or culture, not genuine insights.
Yes. Harman's argument about moral theories is an example. He said we can explain our moral intuitions through social conventions, psychology, no need for objective morals. If the best explanation doesn't require them to be true, then they don't support moral realism. Similar arguments exist in other areas.
If we can explain the feeling without it being true, it loses its power.
But this argument is very broad. It could apply to many intuitions. And the premise that we should only believe what's in the best explanation is debatable. It might even be self-undermining, using intuition about explanation to argue against intuition.
And the second one is about the mystery of reliability.
Right, like Ben Nassaraf's objection to Platonism. If we can't explain how intuitions track truth in abstract areas like logic, math, then we shouldn't believe them. We usually explain reliability through causal connections, but those don't seem to apply here.
My intuition about logic can't be causally linked to some abstract truth.
Right. But one counter-argument is that if reliable just means not mysterious, then explaining why we have the intuitions might be enough, especially if they are necessarily true. Another response is that there might be a connection between our having them and their truth, even if we don't fully grasp it. Also, maybe creatures with radically different intuitions aren't possible, or can't even grasp the concepts, which indirectly supports reliability. And again, justifying this argument would likely involve intuitions.
So skepticism is tough, but has weaknesses. What about defending intuition?
The SEPP gives two main defenses: empirical and rationalist. The empirical one tries to show intuitions are generally reliable using non-intuitive evidence. But that's hard. The rationalist one appeals to the seeming truth of many intuitions. The idea is, if all these things seem so true, maybe intuition is trustworthy.
Like, look at all these true-seeming things. They seem reliable, so intuition must be reliable.
Exactly. This leads to the idea that intuition is self-supporting. The claim that it justifies belief is itself intuitive. The SEP points out that only intuition seems to do this, maybe because it's about justification itself.
Intuition can vouch for itself, but isn't that circular?
Yes, that's the worry. But some circularity might be unavoidable when justifying basic sources of belief. We can't have infinite regress. If some circularity is okay, maybe intuitions is acceptable. There are similar ideas like perceptual dogmatism, but those also often rely on intuition, bringing us back to circularity.
It's like the tools we use to judge knowledge are themselves under scrutiny. Lastly, the SEP talks about experimental philosophy. How has that impacted the debate?
Experimental philosophy brought empirical study to intuitions. The essay identifies 4 parts: the psychology project, understanding thinking; the verification project, checking if intuitions are shared; the sources project, identifying influences; and the variation project, examining differences.
Going beyond thought experiments, using surveys, even brain scans to see where intuitions come from and if everyone has them.
Exactly. They often use surveys with scenarios, variations on thought experiments. Different from traditional philosophy, which focuses on content variations. Experimental philosophy looks at how framing, order, demographics, culture, all that can affect responses.
And has this supported or challenged our use of intuition?
It's complex. There are concerns about whether surveys capture the right kind of intuitions. Maybe differences are due to interpretation, different concepts, or just how people answer surveys. Maybe it's guesses, not intuitions. Controlling for this without biasing the surveys is hard, and some findings haven't been replicated consistently.
So maybe they're not measuring the same intuition philosophers talk about.
Right. Now, skeptics have used the Sources Project to argue for unreliability. Like, if moral intuitions are just emotional or cultural, that undermines them. But these explanations often rely on other intuitions, and the Variation Project, showing differences between groups, is used to support the disagreement argument. But again, are these intuition differences? Also, some argue that even if belief disagreements are bad, intuition disagreements might not be. Sosa says widespread, unexplainable disagreement would be a problem. But do the surveys show that? And there are worries about whether disagreement undermines justification and the self-undermining constraint.
So experimental philosophy adds data, but also raises questions about methodology and relevance.
Yes, it's made us think more critically about our intuitions, how they might vary, and what influences them.
This has been a really insightful deep dive into philosophical intuition. We've looked at what they are, their role in reasoning, the challenges to their reliability, and the impact of experimental philosophy. It's clearly a central topic in philosophy.
Absolutely. We've seen how philosophers define that seeming true feeling, how it's fundamental to our reasoning and the skepticism around it. Experimental philosophy adds a whole new dimension, making us rethink our judgments.
So, as a philosopher, thinking about all this, how might it change how you approach philosophical arguments? And given all the questions about justification, what are the most promising directions for future research on this?
These are the questions that keep philosophy going. I encourage you to look deeper into the sources we discussed and all the work on this fascinating topic.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those philosophical minds working.